Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast, an independent podcast focused on geopolitical risk to serve decision makers in specialty insurance markets, reinsurance, and beyond. I'm your host, David Benyon, and welcome to this special episode produced in association with Mosaic Insurance. Our topic is a multipolar world being played out in financial markets, including challenges facing the Bretton Woods institutions at the core of the norms-based international order, and the weaponization of the global financial system. For this topic, I'm joined by two wonderful guests. Finn McGuirk is Global Head of Political Risk at Mosaic. Finn leads Mosaic's global political risk and trade credit insurance offering, and he has nearly 25 years of experience in the political risk market, initially as a broker before moving to underwriting. He headed political risk and trade credit accounts for Pembroke Syndicate 4000 and similar divisions of AXA, Africa Specialty Risks and CNA Hardy. He also previously worked for Chaucer Syndicates and for Berry Palmer and Lyle. Finn, welcome to the pod.
Thank you very much, David.
My second guest is Maximilian Hess. Maximilian is a political risk analyst and advisor. He's the founder of London-based political risk firm Enmetena Advisory. He's a columnist for Al Jazeera, among others, and he's regularly quoted by broadsheets and interviewed by global news media. His first book, Economic War, Ukraine and the Global Conflict Between Russia and the West, was published in 2023. Maximilian is a fellow with the Foreign Policy Research Institute and an associate fellow with the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He also serves as the Russia, Eurasia and geoeconomics expert at Aurora Macro Strategies in New York. His work focuses on sovereignty, financial markets, international relations, and political economy, and the interaction between these fields. Maximilian, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And so let's get on with the topic at hand. Is the Bretton Woods system of international institutions that we all know fairly well, particularly the IMF, but there are others, becoming more vulnerable or less relevant in its role of a web to protect rights and ensure fairness within this new multipolar era?
I would say not only is it increasingly important, it is actually the core for understanding the international order. So, you hear this term thrown about a lot called, the international rules-based order. I think that that's a relatively poor framework because it bases on the assumption that everybody follows all the rules all the time in the same way. Whereas I actually think the sort of more useful phrase of looking at it is what I call the international economic order. Because in particular, in credit markets and in how countries relate to one another through both their monetary and their fiscal policies, you have a set of standard and accepted norms and institutions, some of which come under the UN auspices, but all of which have some inherent level of politicization, but they are in effect what has made the world work since the post-World War II environment. So, when I talk about those institutions, the key ones are those that we talk about of the Bretton Woods order, this framework that countries agreed to essentially have underpin monetary and fiscal politics following the Second World War. And you have the key ones being, of course, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. You have plenty of other institutions that are important in this. We'll talk about some of them, certainly from arbitration courts to the New York Convention that underpins the enforcement of those arbitral awards. But when I say that it's not necessarily entirely rules-based, but power plays a great role, I would point to the fact that while the UN institutions include the IMF and the World Bank, they are based in Washington, D.C., not in New York or Geneva or Vienna like other UN institutions, and the U.S. still has crucial veto power there. This is a really contested area of politics because, a Chinese official once said when talking about the Paris Club, another one of these institutions that's in some ways even less official than those, said, well, was asked why should China join the Paris Club? And he said, well, where in China is Paris? And then you have, of course, my view and the core point that I make in my book, Economic War, which is that Russia has been waging a war not only against Ukraine, but also against a lot of these core financial institutions. They're trying to get China on board with that. Some of the BRICS policies around that. I'm sure we'll go much more into that later. But this is not only an incredibly important space for how the world works and how money and credit move between countries and enable growth and trade, but also is an increasingly contested one.
I'd say it's absolutely essential for those international institutions to at least have the aim of being fair-handed and apolitical, as it were, in terms of the threat to their survival. So a paper came out from the IMF recently about its aim to be technocratic, fair-handed, and not unduly influenced by its largest shareholders. And I think that the IMF, out of all those institutions, probably plays the best hand in meeting those aims, because they are stated aims that it aspires to, whether or not it 100% achieves that all of the time. I think if you look at some of the other institutions, then the picture becomes a little murkier. But I think the whole system being under stress, they are conscious of the need to state that they are apolitical and they're universally rather than as partisan interests, despite the veto power of some of the largest shareholders. If you look at support from the World Bank institutions, the multilateral development banks, through sub-Saharan Africa particularly, they go to great lengths to stress that they will support Tunisia, even if it takes a movement away from democracy, that it will support states even that have been through coups that have taken them away from democracy, provided they're able to give funding to those countries given sanctions that might have imposed, so that Mali becomes problematic. But I think they recognize that the world is changing and that they have to reinforce their position as being fair to everyone as opposed to representing particular interests at the moment.
I think this point about the world is changing, but to what extent this is an entirely new challenge, or to some degree it was always there, because we're saying this is a rules-based system is a bit optimistic. There is no international court for sovereign debt bankruptcy, and some of the challenges were already there. So, long-term challenges that the World Trade Organization's faced for a long time, for example. But how much of this is old? How much of this is new?
So I'd say that there have always been sort of economic partnerships, and certainly, Dave, this is more sort of playing into your area of interest, but if you go back to the Cold War and the sort of proxy wars and states that were supported by one side or the other, or rebels that were supported by one side or another, there have always been those sort of economic webs as an exercise in soft power and working out who your friends are in the world. I think that what's changing is at the very sort of top, and I'd say that accession to economic power of China and therefore political power of China is a potential game changer as having a fundamentally different interest and looking to set up its own institutions. I mean, nothing yet to rival the IMF, but its own development bank. I shouldn't call it its own, it is multilateral, but China was heavily involved in setting it up. So I think that is causing
this
greater
is what
concern.
was called the BRICS Bank, right?
Yeah. So I think that is causing more thought about the sort of underlying structure and less about the sort of older power plays of states making friends with other states.
I really agree with that. And I think that, one term that I'm, keen in my amateur political scientist hat to introduce is certainly norms rather than rules, right? And there has always been competition over these issues. At one point, it was really the United Kingdom here that, established so many of the rules of international trade. Post-World War II and in Bretton Woods, of course, the United States played an increasingly large role. But I think it's about whether these be areas of active competition or areas where we work together to introduce new norms, because those norms change over time. So we've seen that just in the last 5 years, where the Paris Club, this somewhat informal group of sovereign creditors to other sovereigns that historically met in Paris.
I did want to kind of just briefly qualify that. So the Paris Club kind of follows up on the IMF.
Sure, yes. So the Paris Club follows up on the IMF. Its job essentially historically was to renegotiate official sector bilateral loans from one country to another. So British loans to Senegal alongside American loans and French loans. As China over the last 10 years has become such a large global creditor, it's had some chafing with the system. And we had at the G20 agreement 4 years ago this structure agreed called the Common Framework to bring in China together with some of those partners to discuss how some of its debts are handled. We've just had sort of the first big test case of that in Zambia. Zambia's debt restructuring took years and years to work out, and there's still questions about some of the treatments of other development banks and some of China's own banks within it. But seeing how this process works and how these norms are developed and how we work together to balance different interests in them is going to be hugely important. It's also taking place in Sri Lanka. Ghana is technically taking place outside of the Common Framework. So, a lot of these questions need to come. My sort of view is that we should be focused much more on having that debate and understanding that there will be changes to the norms, but that if we work together rather than actively sort of compete, we see potential benefits. So, we discussed the former BRICS Bank, now known as the New Development Bank. Because of some of the existing rules and norms, although its constituent members, for example, aren't countries that impose sanctions on Russia, it too has had to freeze its loans in Russia because of how it deals with the wider institutional structure and in particular its access to dollars in this system. Will the dollar be as important there 20, 30 years from now? That's very hard to say. I would say more likely than not, but perhaps not necessarily as important as it is today. But having these sort of discussions and turning this into something that is a system that takes its existing rules and practices and adapts them rather than becomes an area of outright conflict, which, for example, is my view of what Russia wants to do today, is very important. And this is something that in some ways is even more contested now than it was during the Cold War. My sort of favorite example here, speaking to an insurance market, is just down the street from where we are today, also on Fenchurch Street, were the offices of a company called Blackball Sea, which was a Soviet-run Lloyd's insurance syndicate that, also then the Soviets adhered to international arbitration award agreements that came in there. So, the Soviets may have had this Marxist theory of grand revolution, but because they wanted their ships to be able to get around the world and have insurance, they sort of played by the rules here. And those kind of practices and ensuring that even if we compete with China on certain trade issues, who's going to build the cars in the future, who's going to be the first one to, do X or Y on Mars, are going to be, real facets of it that we need to understand that these institutions and norms are the way the financial world works. And we have an interest in updating them, but doing so in a healthy, competitive manner rather than doing in a manner that is greatly disruptive to international trade.
I'd say of all the institutions that we talk about today, I think that the Paris Club is the one that most clearly needs to reform or amend its thinking about its position in the world. I think from the insurance market's point of view, the Zambian debt restructuring was a real moment in terms of the different parties involved, because it's no longer about commercial lenders or the Paris Club, or the multilaterals, and the treatment each of those groups would get. Like China had really crashed the party. That's not just out of Belt and Road, it's just out of the level of concessional lending from China around the world. And I think Zambia was a wake-up call in terms of if you get agreement from the Paris Club, that's not enough, because they don't represent the lion's share of the debt in Zambia. And it's really China had this outsized role in being the ones to unlock the door of the debt restructuring. And if you fast forward 5 or 10 years talking about this sort of multipolar world, we're seeing waves of concessional lending and investment now coming from the Gulf to emerging markets to further complicate that. So it becomes clearer and clearer that the Paris Club becomes part of the official creditor picture, but not the main part anymore. And there has to be coordination between these different bilateral interests.
You kind of touched on a point I was going to ask, which is, where we see these challenges being played out. So I was thinking of Venezuela, for example, but sub-Saharan Africa too, right? So places where essentially economic sovereignty is low, states saying they don't want to comply with ICSID, for example. Maybe we should just qualify what ICSID is before we go any further. But yeah, just sort of where we've seen examples of this.
So ICSID is international arbitration under the auspices of the World Bank. For states that sign up to it, it's called signing up to the Washington Convention. And that is supposed to be a way of emerging markets unlocking FDI, because what they're doing is agreeing to be, again, sort of rules-based in terms of how they treat investors. And given that the world has a problem that there isn't a global police force, there isn't a global army, there isn't global enforcement or global bankruptcy court, ICSID is a way of getting as close as we can to ensuring fair treatment, that you do have recourse if you are mistreated, and you can take a country to arbitration and recover your position, recover your investment. There are many arbitration panels around the world for international arbitration. Most of them are to do with commercial disputes. So those commercial disputes might be against the state or arms of the state or state-owned entities. And we're seeing a lot of that come into the market. But really, ICSID and UNCITRAL are there for bits and MITs, for bilateral investment treaties and multilateral investment treaties where you try and recoup lost investments by going to arbitration against the state when you've been unfairly treated.
Obviously, Venezuela is one country that's left it as a relatively, weak international power. And of course, the Venezuelan opposition has said that if they do come to power, and which is still recognized as the official government here in the UK and in the United States, although they don't have effective control there, they have repudiated these moves. But then you have, very ongoing sort of hot disputes around this, particularly involving Russia. So just last week, we had an arbitration court that is, fully compliant with ICSID and sits under its auspices in Stockholm, order that Russia pay Uniper, a German gas company that went bankrupt essentially they had to be rescued in 2022 as a result of the price spikes that came out of sanctions on Russia and Russia's canceling of gas deliveries to Europe. This company, Uniper, was bailed out by the German state, took billions in losses, almost 40 billion, I believe, now has won this arbitral award, however, in Stockholm, saying that Gazprom owes them $14 billion. At the same time, there's an arbitration award in Russia that has gone the other way, that the Russian arbitration court has said, actually, we're going to give this award to Gazprom, and that it is Uniper that owes Gazprom $13 billion. You'll now have these countries and the sort of shareholders in those companies, both of which are state-run, so it's going to be a particularly interesting case on state action, go and potentially seek to have those awards enforced in other countries. So, what could this mean to Russian assets, for example, sitting in Belgium that have been looked at as, key for helping Ukrainian funding go forward? If a German company is at least temporarily owned by the German government sort of goes after them, that adds a whole other level of politicization. So these issues are, very, very live and can lead to some of the largest disputes and then lead to sort of second and third factors around, who, if this can be done in one case, can it be done in another? And what does that mean for where other sovereigns are willing to put their money? Saudi Arabia, China, how will it affect decision making there? So not only does it have impacts on live credit and financing relationships, as well as ones that have gone wrong, but on the future of these markets.
That feels like a step change for ICSID's experience and the use of international arbitrations more generally. I think what we've previously seen is that individual states have withdrawn from ICSID. Thereby, you would think, lessening the confidence of investors and therefore drying up FDI into those markets. So we saw it with Venezuela, with Bolivia, and more recently with Honduras. As political risk underwriters, given that we sort of rely on the rules-based system to ultimately get recoveries in many situations, we would hope that that is a kind of individual situations where countries have strayed from the path, but out of self-interest, development interests, they are likely to come back within the fold. But this is different. This is Russia and its opponents effectively weaponizing ICSID to sort of charge each other with terrible crimes which are potentially valid and try to blow up the system almost. It turns out that everyone's sort of bankrupt now, and it's only the lawyers who are going to get massively rich from the sort of size of claims on either side.
As a political risk insurer for default risk, expropriation risks, what's the kind of stage of things of the situation when you tend to get involved in a situation involving protection of contractual rights?
We don't just rely on arbitrations for all of that, of course. We rely on various means of our clients trying to impose themselves on a counterparty that's defaulted to them. And that is much more immediate insurance. Just to bore you for a second in terms of the market's history of covering arbitration awards, really initially that came out of expropriation covers, PRI covers. And it was added on because sometimes there were disputes about whether or not an expropriation has really happened, which was often about discussing the role of the state. Has it really done anything unfair, or was it acting as a state and therefore it's all above board, though often the lack of compensation is a hint about whether or not it was fair. But so it was often tacked onto PRI covers as a kind of, if we can't agree whether or not there's been an expropriation, if the client wins under a bit or a mit against the state, then evidently they were expropriated. So it was a kind of safety net for those covers. What we're seeing more recently is that we're covering more and more commercial disputes under arbitration award default. And so that's bringing it more into the forefront of our minds. It's no longer a backstop. Quite often under those PRI placements, we're now introducing what we consider more like contractual cover. If under a PPA, the arm of the government doesn't pay for that energy, which effectively might lead to a loss of the investment and could lead to an ICSID arbitration, we're seeing it more under commercial arbitrations. And so we are definitely adding to cover rather than just having this backstop, which is a reinforcement of what we are already doing. So all of this world of arbitration is suddenly more in the market's mind. But I mean, more generally, I'd say we've always relied on, either through the rules-based or through the power of our clients, recoveries being made by countries or state-owned entities ultimately behaving because they have an interest in getting further trade, further investment, and coming back within the fold.
We've already touched on one or two examples of specific countries. I think you mentioned the UAE in Africa earlier, for example, but are there some instances in which bilateral support is at least as prominent, if not more so, than IMF?
I would say absolutely, which is part of what's sort of interesting about the growing economic power of more states than just, China, Russia, the EU, and America, and how that complicates the world. I'd say that quite often as political risk underwriters, we're seeing it as a benefit in some emerging markets. It can be difficult to model how much benefit that is, which gives us a problem in terms of pricing. But we've seen examples. I'd say Pakistan is quite a good example of a state which has been, I'd say, unduly supported, and not in an IMF sense that the IMF is obviously heavily involved there, through conditional lending as sort of last resort from the IMF. We're seeing more GCC money going in, which is certainly superficially and less explicitly conditional. There might be conditions in the background for sure. But we've seen that state strongly supported. And then most recently, I'd say the market was really watching Egypt carefully. There was ongoing IMF support, but I think it was really the UAE and the $35 billion of FDI going into Egypt, which started to soften the market's opinion. So the IMF was there, but also the UAE. And since then, some other states have also pledged concessional support to Egypt, which is this huge, important economy. So we see the world has become more complicated, and we find it extremely hard to model that as a mitigant to the risk. But we are seeing it as a benefit in some emerging markets in terms of the number of supporters that they have.
I think that this is something that also really speaks to the strength of the political risk insurance industry, particularly here in London, right? Not only do clients benefit from, obviously, the cover that they take out from the industry, but they often benefit from the knowledge that the underwriters have and the understanding of local business practices there and in the markets they're dealing with and how they fit into this system. So, Pakistan is a great example. Forgive me if it's 16 or 17 now, but, Pakistan is on its 16th or 17th IMF program, of which they've only ever actually met all the reform terms of once. But underwriters have the ability to understand where Pakistan's relationships are, where it's, to use an Americanism, bread is buttered, why the United States will come in for support in certain areas, why the Gulf countries will come in. So, I was in Pakistan in January and spoke with some former ministers, whereas, one had sort of made very clear to me, said, yes, the understanding is that, sort of regardless of what happened in the elections here, that we'd still get U.S. support at the IMF level, even if we don't meet all commitments, because we're now sending arms to Ukraine. So, these things all tie into one another, and the political risk insurance industry, through having been dealing with these issues for, decades now, is really not only something that can support trade, support investments here, directly on sort of a financial and value at risk basis, but also from understanding the environments that they underwrite.
So just returning to this concept of what has changed, I'm not saying I necessarily agree with this view, full stop, but to wear a sort of realist political risk type hat for a moment, you could say that, the bilateral, or at least, let's say the US has always been the dominant player for the previous post-war period. And that's kind of been like the steel in the glove when it comes to these international norms. But we're just seeing the US step back a little bit potentially, and more of a multipolar environment, which means that that's why these norms are being flouted somewhat or being seen as less certain.
Yeah, I think we can sort of agree on strange showing in the Pax Americana. And so this is a moment, I think, in the sort of financial history of seeing whether those institutions have a life beyond that. Do they have a life in a more multipolar world where everyone sort of appreciates the benefit of them, and that they can show their independence from the largest shareholders in those institutions? So it feels like we're right in that moment.
Yes, and in some ways, I would caveat this with, well, first, my accent will make my inherent bias clear. Secondly, that I don't actually necessarily mean this in a critical way. But one of the reasons why I often use norms, in particular when speaking to U.S. policymakers and U.S. thinkers, and is so keen to discuss this international economic order framework with them is because there are some ways that the U.S. ended up here by mistake, right? So the Bretton Woods system and then the decision in 71 by the Nixon administration to break the gold peg in that system were actually meant to make the dollar less central to the world. The Louvre and the Plaza Accords of the 1980s, which came at a time of, big fears about Japan in particular and the strength of its economy and the shift of manufacturing from the United States there. Some of the same shades of what we see in discussion around China today were, again, also meant to actually weaken the U.S. dollar. They had the opposite impact. And so in some ways, the U.S. ended up in this, such central position. Yes, of course, the decision to put the IMF and the World Bank in D.C. in 45, that was a very sort of clear and calculated choice. But a lot of the norms that have come since through the various administrations have come as sort of a secondary factor of other decision-making, usually where the primary interest has been U.S. domestic policy, not U.S. international policy. What I worry about is the fact that a sort of serendipitous turn of events made this system work relatively well doesn't mean that that will continue to be the case in the future. I do think that China has a very long-term strategy to increase its relative influence in that system. And we see that in things that, don't often get, Belt and Road gets a lot of attention, but a lot of the sort of plumbing of it, China setting up its own arbitration courts, China using terms and new agreements for bilateral investment treaties that underpin the recognition of those courts. These are sort of real key and important steps. Now, does the fact that the Chinese, I think, have a strategy here necessarily mean it's not something we can continue to cooperate on? No, personally, I don't. I think it is. It's just a recognition that economic power is shifting for a long time. At the same time, that's going to, and already has had major reverberations within the U.S. political economy and increasingly within the European one as well. But it won't necessarily be the same path that got us here that works in the future. But yes, I'm always hopeful that U.S. policymakers will at least start to think about these things more strategically. I'm not necessarily currently confident that they do.
Clearly, we're talking a lot about China. Russia's perhaps the other one that we haven't touched on so much. But it's perhaps helpful to look at very different countries and say, well, what are their actual relative economic capabilities and their political objectives?
I think that China is the more interesting in terms of genuinely disrupting the international economic order. I'm not sure really what Russia has for the world at the moment. I think that really what it has is resource wealth. And that feels like last century's wealth. I know that it's still extremely relevant and to some of the other examples that you gave. But I'm not sure that they really have the reputation that they once did in terms of having another development path laid out that could be followed where people would naturally attach themselves to Russia. It looks like a country struggling with modernity. I think China is more interesting in terms of disrupting the overall structure. And then, of course, there's this possibility of a wider teaming up of the global south and emerging markets to change the underlying order.
I fully agree with that. And, I often end up slightly more dovish on China than I think is at least the baseline here or in Washington or increasingly in Brussels, in large part because of how much time and part of my career I've spent looking at Russian foreign policy. But, the sort of pithy short answer I give is that Russia sees this international economic order as a bad thing that keeps it from being a true world power as it feels it should be. So Russia's strategy is effectively to knock down the international economic order. China, I think, is actually largely okay with the international economic order. They just want to be the core node rather than the United States. That's why I think they have this long-term strategy to try to advance these things. I worry sometimes that we risk backing China into a corner and potentially making it more aligned with Russia's view of these things. I don't think that's happened yet. I certainly don't think it's a foregone conclusion that it does happen, but it leads to a very, very large difference in strategy. The one other point that I'll sort of say about those changes there is, the BRICS organization is actually not even a real organization. It doesn't have a secretariat. It's, sort of a gathering club. The BRICS Bank and Development Bank is sort of the only one institution they've managed to stand up. It is still, a tiny fraction of the World Bank. China has other development banks, the AIIB in particular, that are actually much larger and more interesting. But if you take those countries that make up the BRICS acronym, or at least the first four of them, Brazil, Russia, India, China, now in theory potentially including Saudi Arabia in there as well, these are all countries with massive surpluses, right? Trade surpluses. In effect, they have an excess amount of hard currency. Obviously, today the main hard currency is the US dollar. The euro has grown over the last 20, 30 years, but it's still those Western-dominated currencies. What those countries need, in effect, is deficit markets to go and reinvest their excess earnings into, right? So it is in their interest to grow the markets in the emerging world, especially because they don't have the same level of geopolitical strength, or at least willingness to enact it, that Western countries do, right? So for China, I think a lot of people saw Belt and Road, and particularly maybe 6 or 7 years ago, there was a very good paper that came out about the Hambantota port, a big port project in Sri Lanka that China had financed. And, everybody sort of saw this as, oh, this is China trying to get a naval base south of India, and, the 9 Pearl strategy of taking over the Indian Ocean and increasing Chinese things. And I said, well, it's been 9 years through a Sri Lankan default now. China has still not taken over that port. It's basically empty. I mean, they may have title to it. There is no Chinese naval ships there. But actually, if you look at it from how China increased its importance in that Sri Lankan restructuring, how China made its own domestic markets care more about foreign debt, how they found new ways to bring that capital out that isn't just parking it in Mayfair property or the like, those are things that do have a strategic interest for the Chinese state and are in some ways for them, very clear policy successes from Belt and Road. So even if it isn't that, necessarily every one of the investments is what an underwriter may see as a financially reasonable return, when modeling a rail project in Kenya or Tanzania or whatever it may be, but understanding the other political factors that are there is hugely important as well.
I was at an event recently talking about Venezuela, but there was an arbitration negotiator from Sri Lanka there, and he was basically saying the way that the Sri Lankans think about this thing is they know which way their bread is buttered ultimately towards India, but whenever that relationship is strained, it does them some favors to flirt with China every so often.
Again, I'm not necessarily sure this is top of policymakers' mind because it is, in the American view, ancient history because it took place halfway ago in the history of the United States' existence. But such diplomacy, known as debt trap diplomacy, was hugely important in the U.S., building up its international economic influence in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, if you go back to sort of the 1890s, from the port of Veracruz in Mexico to the ports in Colombia, they were all actually controlled by the U.S. Treasury because they had been awarded over for previous debt disagreements. Some of that played a big role in constraining the geopolitical influence of European countries. I mean, the Monroe Doctrine, right? This famous idea that America has about, sort of, well, we get to mess around in Latin America and other people don't, comes immediately out of the U.S. saying, well, sorry, Britain, sorry, France, we don't care about your debt awards in Venezuela being recognized. We care about ours. And today, 120 years later, with these spats between rival Venezuelan governments, the amount of money that Venezuela gets used to from Russia, but still does from China. And then the arbitration disputes, the legal disputes going on in the United States. I mean, you've had ones going on around Citgo, Venezuelan state oil company's U.S. subsidiary, which is now being sold up, going on for, a hugely long time. But in some ways, those of us who live in glass houses cast stones because that's what we did before.
And I mean, talking about pressures on international institutions, and whilst it's not a Bretton Woods institution, I think we should just spare a thought for the World Trade Organization, where it's really been under pressure. I mean, it's effectively been toothless for years through lack of ability to arbitrate and decide disputes. But in terms of pressures being put on it, you're seeing it as much from the EU and the US as from anybody else. So whereas in the past there used to be disagreements over Airbus and Boeing and the size of the hidden subsidies to each of those institutions, now the whole thing is under tremendous pressure with the Inflation Reduction Act out of the States, with all of the EU's carbon border equalization measures. And the WTO, if you take it at its word, is starting to look as if it's anti the kind of combating climate change agenda. And so I really don't know where the WTO goes from here.
The clearest example is the WTO dispute adjudication system doesn't work anymore because nobody can appoint the judges properly. And the U.S. spats with itself over it. There's going to be a big change in sort of the approach there from Biden administration to a potential second Trump administration. But it would be very unlikely that anybody would seriously propose having some kind of new international summit or meetings alongside the UN General Assembly or the like to update the treaties there, because everybody is so focused on the competition rather than the cooperation. And again, because so much of this is norms based, in my view, not everything has to be done in treaty form. And there also is an important argument, I think, for, this sector in particular to put forward that, just because we are competing doesn't mean we don't all have a vested interest in at least understanding, whether you call them rules or norms, but where they're going and where they're headed. And perhaps isn't surprising hearing this from somebody who spends most of his time with the private sector rather than the public sector. But I think the private sector has the ability to generate much better ideas about how to improve these things than necessarily the public sector does.
Just to return to this theme of weaponization of the financial system, I mean, Max, this was a kind of theme of your book.
Yes, I mean, obviously it's a very partisan position in the United States, what the extent of sanctions on not only Venezuela, but perhaps certainly the most partisanly charged one in the U.S. is Iran, right? The Obama administration, 2015, negotiated what's known as the JCPOA, otherwise known as the Iran deal. Trump in the 2016 campaign promised to tear it up, did ultimately 2 years after being elected. One of the interesting things about that, though, that I think shows where the system does work and why it's so important to sort of, in particular, Euro-Atlantic alignment, is lots of European countries said that they were very overtly against Trump unilaterally tearing up this deal. They did not, however, then go and sort of try to create new financing networks to enable Airbus to continue to sell planes to Iran, even if it was the U.S. unilaterally imposing the sanctions. Because there is an understanding that, the U.S. and Europe, I'm not saying necessarily just the EU here, but I'm saying UK, European countries writ large, do work together on not upsetting the apple cart too much on some of these issues. Obviously, the sanctions program against Russia is the largest that we've seen since the Bretton Woods system came about. And, there are, my personal opinion is that it's very much the right thing to do to impose costs on Russia for its unilateral war of aggression, where we don't have any other tools to do so, given Russia's a nuclear armed power in particular. You kind of have to look to sort of some of these geoeconomic networks. But when we think about what policies we're going to impose and how we're going to enforce them, it's very important to keep in mind sort of these rules-based practices and some of these norms that emerge, right? So a big area of discussion right now is how much is the European Union, United Kingdom, and United States willing to target shipping to try to crack down on the Russian so-called shadow fleet, which evades sanctions on the price of Russia's oil? If steps are gone too far, then China and others will look to accelerate the development of their own insurance market. They'll look to increasingly not adhere to some of the claims issued by Western countries, because some of them won't want the precedent of billions of dollars in Euroclear, for example, being seized for benefits. Even if they don't, necessarily agree with Russia's foreign policy decisions, they may still think that countries have the sort of sovereign right to make their foreign policy decisions, even if it's mistakes. So that's going to be a really important part of the sanctions debate going forward is, one, where do these fit in international law and international norms? Two, how much do the countries that are imposing and enforcing and expand them care about that? And then three, what is Russia's sort of counter narrative there, and how much success is it at having other countries join in or at least be willing to tolerate its actions that undermine the system?
That seizing of Russian assets, I'd be fascinated to hear your thoughts on that, because I'd say, for the purposes of this discussion, if you view it sort of economically, I do think that is sort of the West self-harming, because it feels like a breaking of, international rules by effectively collecting reparations before it's even sort of gone to court and it's been established. And I feel like that is the West putting pressure onto its own sort of institutions in terms of its potential behavior. But obviously, politically, I know there's fallacy of like the split between politics and economics has surely been blown up by now. But politically, it's the right thing to do.
It's a question of consistency.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, with the caveat, my opinion is that the West is selective in these things. I think that that's, again, one of the reasons why I'm so keen to say international economic order rather than rules-based order, because the rules apply differently depending on the case in question, right? So, the example that I always have is people mean political risk to mean different things, right? You have political risk as the insurance industry sees it, which I think is sort of the right way to see it. You have people who use it to talk about changing political economies. So that was the way that it was used to apply to the Brexit debate. And then you have people who use it to talk about what's the likelihood of a change in government, whether that be a revolution or whatever. And I say, well, most people would say the U.S. isn't necessarily, or maybe it has become now with the sort of Trump and the aftermath there, become a high political risk environment on that latter, sort of stability in elections one. But actually, if you look at the U.S. from, a PRI policy type analysis, right? So including things like arbitration, award, default, confiscation, expropriation, nationalization, look at the story of TikTok, right? So TikTok not only has the CFIUS Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States order saying that they should divest, has subsequently been the subject to U.S. legislation doing so. And who's the guy putting in an offer to buy TikTok? The former Treasury Secretary who signed the CFIUS order to do that. If you were saying in Kenya, the former finance minister, said I had to sell my business and now 4 years later is coming in to buy my business, I think as an insurer, you'd say, well, you've got a pretty clear claim there. On that stuff when it comes to Russia and the sovereign assets there, international lawyers are very keen to make that point. There's sort of some talk about, well, how could, Ukraine's potential right to reparations be assigned to a financing structure? Most of it is sort of too clever by half. I will be the first one to say again, and this is probably too far off the topic of conversation, strategically, I actually do think in this case it is the right move to do what they've done with at least financing the frozen assets. There's plenty of precedent for the returns from frozen assets being, directed in certain places, whether it be from the U.S. embargo in Cuba or more recent sanctions on Iran. So, I think the legal minds and the international lawyers can find out the right way and are working very hard. I'm actually, certainly very well aware right now that they were attending the Ukraine Recovery Conference and G7 meetings over the weekend. Some of the leading legal minds on these issues are working on those. The legal structure that they come up with will be very important to people like us. It will not be important to the global South and the like. And I think there is where a little bit more honesty about saying, hey, not everything in the system is always entirely fair.
But when you've got new institutions like, well, you mentioned China has several, but the New Development Bank, for example, it's sometimes suggested as if they're going to rival or replace the Bretton Woods type architecture, right? But if they did, wouldn't they just end up falling into the same traps? There would be accusations of inconsistency where it's just a case of Chinese foreign policy interests, or even worse, depending on how you think about it, they might just end up falling back on the same IMF rules anyway.
Well, I do think there's evidence out there to support you being sanguine about China's involvement and sort of ending up in the same place. And I do think there is a bit of hysteria in the Western press over China's role. But yes, if you look at a situation like Peru, they're currently going through an arbitration because a Chinese port operator wasn't fairly treated there. So that is all in accordance with what you would expect. If you look at this Sri Lankan example of the port that the Western press was so het up about in terms of China as a debt collector, yes, they had rights to take over the port, and they did. And that's a normal condition of loans from our point of view as political risk underwriters, and what would expect our client to do if things had gone that badly wrong. And if anything, if you look at China in Angola, there have been at least 2 soft reschedulings of Chinese debt in Angola, which haven't been widely lauded in the press, but I think secretly in the political risk market, we're tremendously grateful for that, given the size of exposure that we run on Angola. So if anything, they've been a bit softer than you might expect.
For non-insurance people, right? So for people who read Bloomberg or the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, you'll often see people use CDS, the CDS rate, credit default swap rate for sovereign, is synonymous for the probability of default in that country. You also have, your own rates set in the political risk insurance market. Obviously, they vary from policy to policy and country to country. They won't necessarily be the same for one port or another port in even the same country. But both of those, I always get really frustrated when I read Bloomberg or something say CDS, so the probability of default is up 30%, whatever. And I say, no, the CDS or political risk insurance rate don't measure just the probability of default. They also take into account the potential for recoveries, right? And so these rules and norms in this system and these institutions, they enable the recoveries, whether that be one actually goes all the way through with the arbitration claim, whether one sells on that claim after it's been assigned from the insured to the insurer. But, we can skip all the, complicated sigma maths of actually calculating probabilities of default out of credit default swap rates. But the most important part to remember, whether it be that rate or the insurance rate, is the underwriter or the bank writing CDS is making certain assumptions about the recoveries that are just as important as the fact that you'll get to the stage of having to pay a recovery in the first place.
And really, this discussion from an underwriter's point of view is more about the sort of fabric of the international economy, the norms, and ultimately the position we'll end up in. Like, what recourse do you have? What motivations are there for people to behave, and so forth? So yes, it's much more about that sort of holistic, where might you end up, as opposed to just the probability of default.
Thank you for listening to this special episode in association with Mosaic Insurance. I've been your host, David Benyon, and I'd like to thank Mosaic and my guests, Finn McGuirk and Maximilian Hess. That's all for now. Please tune in next time. Production was by Peter McGill, and Lawrence Durkin provided the music.